Game 1 of the semi-finals of the World Cup was played in Baku today. So we have two matches, Pavel Ulyanov against Sergei Karyakin and Anish Giri against Peter Svidler. And Giri Svidler is the game that I would like to look at now. An intriguing clash, youth against experience. Anish Giri, 21 years old, against Peter Svidler, 39 years old, and he's a 7-time Russian champion. That's something very special. But Anish Giri, he's the man of the moment, rated number 6 in the world, and many now feel that he's the odds-on favourite to win this World Cup. Well, let's see what happens. Giri with the white pieces, and it's a mainline Spanish. Now, Giri has just played c3, and that invites black to play the martial attack, which has a very good reputation. But Giri, he knows his theory so well, and if you understand the martial gambit, then it's possible to play one of these long forcing lines and maybe, get a slight advantage in some endgame. Well, that suits Giri's style very well. So I think Svidler made a good fighting choice here by playing the mainline Spanish, but a closed variation. Now, h3, so absolute mainline, preventing bishop g4 before you play d4, and bishop b7. Well, this is the Zaitsev variation, very popular in the 1980s. This was, in the 1980s, the absolute main line. If you recall, there were many famous Kasparov-Karpov games in exactly this line. And now, bishop f8 is the normal move here. The idea of the Zaitsev variation is to put pressure on the e4 pawn very quickly, preventing this knight from switching round in the standard way to g3, because there's early pressure on e4. But intriguingly, Svidler did not play bishop f8 in this position, which is the absolute standard move. He played an unusual continuation. He exchanged on d4, giving up the centre. Now, if you do that, you have to be absolutely certain you're going to get some decent play against this big pawn centre here. Let's see how he did it. So the knight switches round, and now here comes the pressure. Of course, white has to keep that bishop, very important. Now bishop f6. So you can see that already there is some pressure on white's centre. But white has a whole move to try and kind of secure his central position. Intriguingly, Svidler has actually reached this position on 2 previous occasions, once with white and once with black. So he obviously feels that this position is worth playing for white. A couple of months ago, he faced as black bishop f4, and in January, Svidler had this position himself with white and played knight h2. Giri, after not much thought, played rook b1. Well, it's a sound move. Clearly there's going to be some pressure on the long diagonal, so the rook moves away. Here's the idea for black, c5. So black is hitting out at white's centre, and the position now resembles some kind of Benoni structure. So the pawn comes to d5, shutting out the bishop on b7, but as some kind of compensation, black has a nice pawn majority on the queen side. Knight c4, very important that Spanish knight comes back into play from a5, so good idea, and comes back into play right into the middle of the board. Now really here, white wants to use his central majority to offset black's queenside majority. But it's not so simple to do that. I mean, the most obvious way would be to exchange and to get in f4. But this blunt method of going forward certainly has its drawbacks. You can see the knight can drop back to g6. That's a little bit different from a normal Benoni, because of course there would be normally a pawn on g6. So the knight actually is quite annoying looking at the pawn on f4. And you can see the bishop can lock into d4, And sometimes even this queen can shoot out to h4 and get some decent counterplay here. So, white wouldn't obviously make progress in that position. Let's go back. So after knight e5, Giri wants to keep as many pieces on the board as possible. I think, a sound, logical decision when, black lacks a bit of space and these pieces rather tread on each other's toes. Knight g6 from Svidler. I think that's a nice move. I repeat, looking at these squares and making room for the bishop, just as in the other variation. Knight g3, that's actually the first new move in this game. Previously, bishop d2 had been played, but not noticeably better than the game continuation. Anyway, knight g3 looks like a very normal move, trying to come into perhaps f5, sometimes h5. And now Svidler thought for 17 minutes in this position, and I think he came up with, was certainly a very good practical move. He played bishop c8. That knight on f5 is always going to be a problem, so he's prepared to perhaps give up his bishop for that knight. And now, well, for example, knight f5, knight b6 is aiming at that knight. Well, Giri played rook f1 to preempt bishop c3. Okay, I think that's a reasonable move. Knight b6, so making room for this bishop. Knight g4. Well, that's a bit annoying, and you don't really want to move the bishop in to c3. Then it could be chased away straight away by knight e2, or, well, there are other moves there as well, but yeah, bishop c3 doesn't look so attractive. So it's decision time, and Svidler made the practical decision just to give up the bishops, but I think preserving the dark square bishop is really the important one here. H takes. So Giri is starting to think about an attack on the H file. Queen takes is also possible, but H takes, well, moving towards the centre looks reasonable to me. H6, so trying to take control over some light squares. That looks like a reasonable move. And here, well, once again, it's not so easy for white to move forward. Let me give you a quick illustration of what can happen. Well, okay, let's play a4. Bishop e5. Starting to look at these dark squares, and if white just rushes forward with f4, then, well, that is actually checkmate. Okay, it's not going to happen, but it's just an illustration that, white can't just ram forward without any thought. I think probably the soundest move in this position is bishop e3, just to cover d4 and perhaps prepare to move the queen up to e2. Yeah, I mean, I like this move, but still, I feel black is all right in this position. Instead, Giri chose this very direct move, knight f5, which, I mean, certainly looks very threatening, looking at d6 and h6, but knight e7 is a nice move, just wanting to exchange off that knight. And now b4, and Svidler is starting his queenside counterplay. I like b4 because it potentially gives this bishop an anchor on c3 in some circumstances, but also just prepares to advance the a pawn to get some counterplay on the queen side. If white wants to sort of take the sting out of this counterplay, then a3 is possible. But I feel that black should be okay in this position. So, for example, queen d7. I don't think there's too much wrong with black's position there. Giri chose to play g3, which is really building up for the kingside attack. And this is worrying, perhaps with the idea of switching to the h file. a5 played. So Svidler keeps on track with his queenside counterplay. King g2, Giri building up on the kingside. a4. And here, if white wants to sort of keep things under control, then bishop d3, I think, is a reasonable move. Of course, black has counterplay here, but one should be able to control this with rook e2 eventually. But I think chances are balanced there. But Giri made a very committal move. He took on a4. Now, this is probably the last moment when white can kind of keep things under control. You can play a3, and I think in this position it's a balanced position. For instance, queen b3. Well, I think black has enough counterplay here. Svidler was saying after the game he wasn't sure about this for black because maybe this pawn could be weak, but actually white has sensitive pawns here, so I think black is absolutely fine. But Giri really went for it here with queen d3, so he's clearly looking to get something going on this diagonal. But knight g6 stops that. Very nice. Giri still playing for the attack. Very brave. But here, after knight a4, he obviously realised that things were not so clear, and he took on a4. And Giri offered a draw here. Well, Svidler said afterwards that he felt in this sort of double-edged position, it's only game one, and he could afford to risk a little bit here. And he recaptured and declined the offer. Good decision. Although this attack looks very frightening, in fact, black has it under control. Svidler judged the situation very well, and he didn't take on a2, but knight e7 is an excellent move. That pawn on a2 is not running away, but he challenges that strong knight on f5. If that knight goes, then it's very hard for white to build an attack. Here, well, of course, one could sack the knight, but actually, well, black is solid enough here. There's not too much going on. Instead, Giri sacked the g-pawn. There, this is pretty frightening. The h-file now open, but Svidler judged there's not too much going on, and now this rook provides some serious counterplay. And the knight comes back to g6. Okay, the knight comes back, but now it's time for black to counterattack. Players were very short of time at this moment. g6, this is well judged. Svidler said afterwards he almost had a heart attack after he played this move. He suddenly thought that bishop takes g5 might be possible with the idea of rook takes queen and bishop takes, and he suddenly thought, oh my goodness, what's going on here? But in fact, after a little calculation, he realised he's absolutely fine. Rook takes f2. If king takes, of course, knight check, and you take the bishop. And if king g1, there's a beautiful saving move here. Rook h2. So if king takes, once again, there's a knight fork on g4 to win the bishop. And if rook takes, then knight f3, and you take the rook. Beautiful saving idea. Instead, Giri checked, but now actually white has nothing in this position. He checked again, and Svidler could take, but short of time, he decided to repeat the position. Giri has nothing better, and only on the 40th move of the time control, Svidler took. Giri played queen h5, but after knight g6, Giri resigned. You can play a check, but there's absolutely nothing doing in this position. Black's king is completely safe with these pieces. So, for example, here, Black's basically a piece up for nothing. So, well, an excellent game by Peter Svidler. After the game, he said it's more that Giri lost the game rather than he had won it. He said it's more that he lost the game than I won it, if you see what I mean. But I think that's being too modest, actually. Svidler made some key decisions in this game that were absolutely correct, and I think Giri really overestimated his chances on the king's side. That was the first classical game that Giri had lost in nearly 4 months. There we go. So maybe he's just getting tired at the end of quite a long tournament. So tomorrow, Giri with the black pieces is in a must-win situation. In the other game, Ilyanov with the white pieces almost beat Karyakin, but Karyakin clung on by his fingernails to draw the game.